There are a lot of misconceptions about mental health issues. There's a stigma, if you will. Tell someone you have mental health issues, and you might be labeled a freak or an oddity. Or among the particularly uncouth, you might be accused of being a psycho. But mental health issues are far more complex than that. In fact, there are as many variations, from benign to severe, as there are people who suffer them. These issues could be as straightforward and common as depression, or they could be as severe as heavy schizophrenia and beyond. Because most people don't understand mental health issues, living with such things can be quite difficult, both for the sufferer and for those who care about the one who suffers. Enter psychotherapy, one of the newest branches of the medical field. Before therapy, we only really had art and family to help us deal with such issues. Neither are always well equipped, or even willing to help. But at least, art was, and still is, a venue for us to understand what we ourselves and others might be suffering from. So let's, from a non-medical point of view, take a look at that art, specifically about how horror cinema approaches mental health issues.
Jesus Christ, man. What the fuck did you do?
Try and calm down.
To my face.
Try and keep calm.
Where the fuck is my face?
Let's start with therapists, psychiatrists, and psychologists.
And see if anything resonates, okay?
Okay. Sorry, are you gonna, like, keep touching me like that, or...?
Oh boy. Generally, therapists are misrepresented by storytellers, with very little understanding of what they actually do showing up in cinema. That is probably because therapy is a slow-going process, with the dialogue between therapist and patient often incrementally moving towards sustainability, rather than a miracle cure. Therapy is often viewed through a lens of nightmares, or often the therapist himself is a walking nightmare, like Dr. Hannibal Lecter. He's probably the most famous cinematic psychiatrist. But he doesn't really fit the theme of this episode. This episode is about the process of going insane while being a character in a horror film. Hannibal Lecter isn't going nuts, he's just a cannibal psychopath, but he's very much in control of his own world. The same can't be said for his patients. In the first season of the TV series Hannibal, his patient, FBI agent Will Graham, is losing touch with reality.
Do you have a history of sleepwalking, Mr. Graham?
I'm not even sure if I'm awake now.
Hannibal adds to Will's misery by playing mind games. It made for incredibly potent television, because we as audiences felt we were going insane along with Will. In later seasons of the show, Will has managed to regain control of his mental health, but the show itself lost focus because of that, and it became somehow less interesting. The dramatic arc and exploration of character was tremendous, captivating and horrifying in that first season, because it followed the patient, the one losing touch with reality. And horror cinema is in itself a genre about losing touch with the world we know, having it replaced by a waking nightmare. And more than once, going insane has been described as living in a nightmare. Madness and mental health is a rich field for storytellers. Some very potent films deal with insanity, and they often mirror the absurdity of society by presenting the world through the warped lens of the already insane. Naturally, horror films has also heavily plowed this field. Insanity is practically a mainstay from the early days of horror cinema. Sure, several brilliant films also show normal people challenged by insane villains they cannot possibly reason with. But the idea that we, ourselves, might be insane and might lose our grip on reality makes for deeply gripping and certainly terrifying journeys. The earliest horror film most now remember is the classic German expressionist film The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. I covered this film in episode 3, Dawn of Horror Cinema, so let me just give you the highlights. A young man tries to rescue his beloved from an evil doctor and his murderous somnambulist, But in the end, the twist reveals that the young man is in fact insane, and the authority figure of the doctor is a benevolent and kind-hearted mental health care professional. I was a kid when I first saw the film, and when I came to the ending, I literally said out loud, "So that's where that cliché comes from. He was insane all along." Despite the twist ending in Caligari, early horror cinema didn't often let its protagonist go off the deep end. Usually, the madness would be treated with black humor, such as in James Whale's The Old Dark House, where a parade of creepy crazed people make life difficult for the normal people. The madness would be reserved for the villain, like in Mad Love. Just look at Peter Lorre's face. He's totally bonkers and must, because of this, die horribly. Things got a bit more interesting in The Black Cat, where a heroic major character shows signs of obsessive madness. But he's not the primary hero. This allowed one character to go insane, while the other sympathetic male character could stay handsome and sane and get the girl. Naturally, the one going insane would be played by Bela Lugosi, while the hero who gets the girl would be played by the blandly handsome David Manners.
That's what I'm going to do to you now. Tear the skin from your body.
So David Manners gets to stay sane with Julie Bishop, while Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff get to murder each other. The Black Cat is actually a really good minor horror classic, usually overlooked when people talk about universal horror. But the madness on display is mild, very mild. Just a bit of obsession and post-traumatic stress, really. Yes, through the 30s, most horror films kept insanity at a polite distance. And if a character did have a freak out, they often collected themselves in time for the climax, finally acting responsible. If you can call hurting that poor terrified monster responsible, that is. But yes, the insanity was usually reserved for the lead villain, and not the lead hero. That all began changing slightly in the 1940s, by showing characters that were originally considered sympathetic, who then turn out to be insane murderers. It also happened in non-horror films, like the thriller Gaslight, with a character thinking she's going insane, but learning it was a secret plot to drive her mad. In this film, based on the 1938 play by Patrick Hamilton, Ingrid Bergman is slowly driven to the brink of insanity by her husband, Charles Boyer. The film was so successful at communicating this concept that we got the term gaslighting from it. Gaslighting: manipulate someone by psychological means into questioning their own sanity. Over the next couple of decades, the trope became more and more popular, whether it was a husband and mistress conspiring to scare a wife to death, such as in the excellent Les Diaboliques, or a wife and her lover conspiring to drive a husband insane, such as in The Pit and the Pendulum. Considering this particular husband was played by Vincent Price, they of course succeed in driving him bonkers. Of course, this film still told the story from the point of view of Vincent Price's brother-in-law, who in the end does get his own pretty little thing as a reward. Things get a lot more interesting in the mid-1960s. That was when Roman Polanski got on the scene with the critically acclaimed thriller Knife in Water. Many of Polanski's films deal with insanity, but none do it better than Repulsion. Repulsion is a landmark film in the horror subgenre of main characters losing their minds. The film follows a young Belgian woman living in London. To say she is sexually repressed would be an understatement. Carole Ledoux, as played by Catherine Deneuve, is hinted at having been sexually abused as a child. According to movie logic, that makes her prone to a severe case of "I wanna kill all men." Deneuve's character feels a repulsion at the sexual attention lavished upon her by a series of increasingly creepy men. The more attention she gets, the more she loses touch with reality, and the less she follows conventional societal rules. To put it mildly. Honestly, we can't take Repulsion as any sort of answer to what happens with a character who was sexually abused as a child. Most victims find a way to live healthy lives, and that, pointedly, includes the victim or victims of Roman Polanski. However, Repulsion remains a staggeringly effective film, and it is one of the most celebrated journeys into madness in cinema. Polanski continued the themes of societal disassociation in his later films, Rosemary's Baby and The Tenant, both of which are known as part of Polanski's apartment trilogy, which started with Repulsion. Whatever you might think of the man himself, there is no denying Polanski has influenced cinema, including horror cinema's approach to mental illness. The concept of insanity certainly plays a major part in Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of Stephen King's novel, The Shining. I say Kubrick's adaptation specifically because the director chose not to follow the book to the letter. King famously dislikes the film. In King's novel, Jack Torrance suffers from alcoholism, and it is driving him and his family into oblivion. In Stanley Kubrick's film, the character is less an alcoholic rather than a man going steadily insane. Seeing ghosts sure doesn't help. The combined legacy of films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Gaslight, Repulsion, and The Shining can be strongly felt in our own century. Cinema has continued to play with the trope of insanity from twisty narratives like Identity, where, major spoiler alert, the protagonist turns out to be a figment of imagination in a plot that plays out entirely inside a serial killer's head. In Black Swan, a troubled and ambitious ballerina lets her drive for perfection shatter her own reality. The insanity continues, increasingly cleverly, in The Witch, where the entire film can be seen either as an actual story of witches and evil goats, or also as a feminist exploration of the abandonment of God. Or, in a fan theory confirmed as possible by director Robert Eggers, that the family was poisoned by bad crops, with a hallucinogenic fungal infection called ergot driving them all bonkers, triggering their puritanical nightmares.
Like Philip, I conjure thee to speak to me.
I think perhaps the most interesting recent film to play with the concept of main character insanity, depression, and displacement is Jennifer Kent's The Babadook. Is the Babadook real? Or is it the manifestation of Essie Davis's extreme mental trauma brought on by the death of her husband? Both she and her young son, played creepily by Noah Wiseman, suffer together in a grim and dark house just begging for a haunting, be it the haunting of their shared grief, or their shared disconnect from the real world, as the trauma of their fractured lives becomes all-consuming. Perhaps the reason I really like this film is the ending. So often in stories about characters going nuts, there is no help. Or conversely, they are totally cured. But mental health doesn't necessarily have just a bad outcome or a good outcome. It isn't black or white. You won't go completely off the rails and become a mad torturer just because their old daddy was. And you won't likely find that your descent into madness was all a ploy by an evil person in your life, hoping to drive you off the edge. You won't be locked in a duel to the death with Boris Karloff, though if you gotta go, that sounds like one heck of a way to die. You won't murder a bunch of salacious men because you have a troubled relationship with your own sexuality, like having been raped by father figures such as actual fathers, priests, or movie directors. You won't be met by the perfect storm of ghosts absorbing you into their hotel, though alcoholism can do a lot of damage. You won't find that you're the figment of a madman's imagination. And you won't, I sincerely hope, take life advice from a goat.
Wouldst thou like to live deliciously?
Yes.
But you will, with the help of both those you love and of professionals, find that you can manage your mental health issues. And what you'll end up with is sustainability. And more often than not, that is enough. It will have to be, until we in society become better at dealing with the trauma of mental health issues, both those mild and those severe. Or perhaps in the future, we really will find a magic cure for all ills. There's always hoping. In the meantime, we still have the movies.
You're trespassing in my house!
My name is Wolf Craft. This is History of Horror. If you liked the episode, I'd sure appreciate you liking, sharing, and subscribing. Join me next time for episode 16, Todd Browning and the Road to Freaks. Also, if you want to check out some of my other works, I'm an author. My science fiction novel God of Desolation is currently available on Amazon, and check out my upcoming mystery novel Richly Drawn, soon to be available for pre-order at inkshares.com. Thanks a plenty.